Hello, and welcome back to Parley, the show where you folks support the other stuff I make by paying me monthly to talk about the topic of your choice. This month, Xalveris has chosen some discussion about reducing opportunity cost, making it so the player doesn't have as strict a limitation on how many build-making choices they make. Xalveris says, in Genshin Impact, we sometimes see the addition of a fifth team slot for a trial character, usually as part of a character's story quest. Yeah, so in Genshin Impact, you have four slots for characters on your team, and the whole gimmick of the game is that you can swap between characters, those four characters, at any time, to combo their abilities, elements together. Oftentimes, if a character provides a buff, that buff will stay active if you swap characters, and when they don't, that's also an interesting balancing thing. And that's a lot of the game's core game design. A lot of the game's build systems revolve around that synergizing or lack thereof. Sometimes in a character's story quest, when a character is introduced or we focus on a character for a while, they allow you to try that character a little bit. You play as that character a bit for storytelling, but also to, I guess, advertise the character a bit, right? And when they do that, they give you a fifth team slot. They let you hit a different combination of keys, or on mobile, you just tap the character's portrait or whatever, and you can swap to that fifth character for a very limited time, just as part of the story. Again, in a few other contexts, not very often, you get a fifth character. Xalveris' question is, what if this fifth slot became a permanent addition, where we could select a character for it like the other four? How would this change team buildcraft for different content? Would you make different buildcraft decisions for weapons and artifacts? You've previously mentioned for Warframe how the limitation of 8 mod slots is a good thing to force the player to make more selective choices. Would you say something similar here for character slots? Yes. Thanks for the question. Great parlay question. Yes. No, I'm only partially kidding. I want to start by saying I don't necessarily think it's always bad to reduce opportunity cost, to make it so the player doesn't have as many things competing for the limited spaces they have. It's not obviously always bad to do that. These games have this number of slots because they've determined that that is an interesting number of slots for making team decisions for various reasons, all sorts of reasons, in Warframe and Genshin Impact and other games. And changing that isn't bad because reducing it is always bad or something. That makes no sense. They picked that number in the first place. I just think it's usually bad because generally erring on the side of less is better than erring on the side of more. So, in Warframe, would I prefer 7 or 9 mod slots? 7. In Genshin Impact, would I prefer 3 or 5 team slots? 3. I don't want either of those things, really. Maybe in Warframe, but all things being equal, I would rather reduce it a bit than increase it a bit, except to the point of absurdity. And the reason is that a lot of the interest in the team making decisions comes from the fact that there could be something else in that slot. The more you increase the number of slots, the more you can just take everything that would be relevant to a certain combination, and there's really no reason to make those choices. Putting it a different way, another thing that isn't usually great about allowing the player less opportunity cost, more space on a build, is that it punishes the player more for not having everything. Because if you don't have everything, but the game doesn't let you use everything, even if you had it, then you're not at as much of a disadvantage if you don't have everything that enables a certain kind of build. Stuff like that. Now, we won't get into it too much. In Genshin Impact, there are also a lot of reasons why that would have its own problems. For example, one reason for 4 characters in Genshin Impact, as a minor reason, is that it helps adapt to co-op. Genshin Impact has a bit of a unique co-op experience where rather than you having an ally that has their own team, you split the 4 character slots on your team. So if I play with one of you in co-op, I have 2 characters on my team and you have 2 characters. We get the benefit of 2 characters on the field at once, but the detriment of not cycling through 4 characters, not stacking buffs from 4 characters, only kind of too, although a lot of buffs share between teammates. Co-op in Genshin Impact is a mess in general, but that initial idea is interesting. When you're with 4 players and all 4 characters are on the field at once, but you don't swap through, that's not just, easier or harder, it's different. It really changes the gameplay experience. Again, I personally don't think it's well balanced at all in practice, but that idea is really interesting, possibly. And it creates a fun experience where your opportunity cost is even more increased. You're really heavily encouraged to combo with your allies because your damage drastically drops if you don't use, good elemental reactions or combos of elements. Sometimes it's the same element. But anyway, doing that in interesting ways. That's where all the damage in Genshin Impact comes from. So forcing that to be, cooperative teamwork, but not making it too specific is the dynamite for that system. I just feel like the actual balance in practice is like really weird and not that good. But whatever. The 2 parts of this question after that little prelude are: would you make different build choices for weapons and artifacts, like if you had more space in a build, in Genshin Impact specifically, but also in general? And what do you think about reducing opportunity cost in general? And I've used this little prelude part to establish that, again, I it's not that I think it's always bad to do that, but I think it would usually be bad. I feel like the developer is going to get kind of close to a good amount of opportunity cost, and I would be surprised to find a lot of games where you would want to increase it. Like, it would have to be very, very tight, very restricted. And the game would have to be designed in a way where it would be good if it wasn't restricted, but yet they restricted it. Like, that's odd, Maybe I should give an example of, let's imagine a hypothetical game where I would want to increase the team size or something. So this would be, we can use Genshin Impact as an example. Sometimes enemies in Genshin Impact are vulnerable to certain elements, and other times they're resistant or even immune to certain elements. Not too often. This wouldn't be the end of the world, but as an example, it'll work. In Genshin Impact, if you run 2 characters of the same element, you get a bonus effect called Elemental Resonance, and there are some of them very powerful. The problem, if you were to make Genshin Impact teams have only 2 character slots, is that if you were to run a combination of elements that gave you elemental resonance, you would categorically be making it so there is a type of enemy in the game that you cannot do any damage to, without physical attacks, which are not a huge thing in Genshin Impact. In other words, if you got pyro resonance by running 2 pyro characters and your team size was 2, getting that resonance effect would 100% of the time make it so some enemies are immune to all of your team's damage, except for, again, usually your normal attacks do very little damage or are elemental. That's just awkward. There's a way in which that's not a huge deal in Genshin Impact as it currently stands. But you can see how there would be a pretty strong argument for adding just a 3rd character. The game's numbers and design seem to favor adding a little more space at that point, for a lot of reasons. Or another one would be having a healer as one of the characters. If not all your characters are going to heal, and you need to sacrifice one of your 2 slots to get some healing, that feels really bad. That pushes the game a little more in the direction of being very skill focused. You need to avoid all damage so you don't have to sacrifice half of your damage to have, a healer. In Genshin Impact, lots of healers do significant damage, but as an example, you get it. With 4 character slots, you're losing relatively less damage if your healer does not as much damage, which they often don't. So it's not a huge deal. You can still have a very powerful team and bring healing. Again, it would beg the question, why are there even healers if it's such a gigantic disadvantage to include one? And so 4 slots really helps balance that out. So a bunch of examples I hope you can see. You would use Genshin Impact, that's better than making up a game. A lot of examples of how you could have a game where the amount of space available to make a build is kind of too restricted. But I feel like a lot of the reason to make it the size it is pretty obvious. And so it'd be more likely that a game would give you too much space. Or I think what really happens in practice is the game makes upgrades in such a way that they're just not fighting for the space that's there enough. In Warframe, for example, there are plenty of mods. The problem isn't that there aren't enough upgrades for that amount of space. 8 mod slots seems like a good amount for the amount of, damage stats available for weapons, for example. It's just that a lot of mods are so bad that they're not competing for those slots. There's not enough competition for them. I'm not necessarily sure I'd want to reduce the number of slots as much as I'd want to make the mods that are competing for those slots stronger, simply because then you're adding more interesting choices to the game. Reducing the number of mod slots would also kind of do that, but if you could also do it by making the upgrades more interesting, I guess I would do both. But you get it. It could also be a case of the things not fighting enough for space. One of Genshin Impact's triumphs from a game design and build system perspective is that because of the elemental comboing system, because a lot of your damage comes from elemental reactions and combinations of elements, or even running more characters of the same element for the resonance effect or something, because so much of the damage comes from those sources, every slot inherently has a high cost. Even a random character that does nothing of a given element is surprisingly competitive for one of those slots, just because combinations of elements are such a focal point of the game's effectiveness. That's a really nice piece of design that helps the game, helps the character that does something kind of weird maybe be relatively good, just because a character of that element that puts out any meaningful amount of that element is often going to be kind of good enough to provide a team value. And then if you find a place where their unique utility is good, then it's great. So yeah, I think in general, that's why I wouldn't want to restrict that too much. Okay, so now to tackle what you asked as the first part of the parlay, because I hope I've thoroughly established, yeah, I really don't think you'd want to reduce the opportunity cost most of the time. Restricting the character's space is, I would say, would rarely hurt a reasonably well-designed game. I think a lot of players just don't like it. Like, they don't want to have it too restricted. Every game with meaningful build choices has it somewhat restricted, I think. That's what meaningful build choices means, basically. You either couldn't have gotten every possible upgrade, like that was the opportunity cost, or you just can't equip them all, some combination of those things. Or there isn't buildcraft. If you can equip everything, then there aren't builds, really. The definition in some ways includes the idea that you must pick and choose a bit, I think. That being said, again, I think a lot of players, and you can hear this in how they discuss games like Warframe, they at least they're under the impression they don't want that, when in fact you would either remove that entire game system or restrict the choices. Like, it doesn't really make sense to have it but let the player equip everything. And I think a lot of people just kind of haven't thought that much. If the game was, 15 mod slots on a weapon, what would even be the point of that? And I think a lot of people haven't gotten that far because they're not game designers. But yeah, that doesn't really make sense. Again, it might make sense to remove that game system. Don't get me wrong. There might be games where, like obviously it wouldn't make sense to make builds if you can just equip everything. But maybe you just shouldn't make a build for that element. Maybe the game isn't doing that well. An argument I would accept for Warframe is that maybe there just shouldn't be weapon modding because it's so regular. And if you restricted it to the point that you had, very restricted choices or whatever, a lot of the current audience would think it would just feel bad. Now, personally, I would love to see Warframe have 6 mod slots on weapons because I'm crazy, but I really do think that would suit the game's design very well. I just don't think players would like it, and you shouldn't not care about that, of course. But I don't care about that. I mean, I don't care about that for Warframe because I'm not a developer of Warframe. I don't think the weapon building system accomplishes enough in its current form. Maybe opening it up, which basically gets rid of it, or heavily restricting it, which makes it actually matter. You actually would need to make careful choices. That would be interesting. They're not going to do it, but it would be interesting if they did. It's frightening in Warframe how much you'd have to reduce the amount of mod space the player had. I said 6, but I honestly think it might be more like 5 or 4, which is pretty messed up. But anyway, let's not get into that right now. That's a whole topic. Would you make different build decisions for weapons and artifacts if you had more space? That's kind of the other half of this question. Yeah, specifically how, that might be challenging. It does require some imagination. That's why people wrongly suggest that it would be really good if the game had way more space for mods or to character options, because it is a little difficult to imagine how broken that would be, I guess, without, you know. So in Genshin Impact, I'll start giving examples. Genshin Impact is a great game for examples in some ways. 4 to 5 is also a nice number. A lot of good supportive artifact sets in Genshin Impact. This is your gear on your character. A lot of good supportive effects on those sets do not stack. So I would argue that those sets get a little worse in a world where there are 5 characters in context, because you would be more likely to overlap them. You know, if you're only going to put one set of artifacts on a character, having them that set on a lot of characters gets a little less valuable, because you just don't need very many characters that use it. You know, if a character uses it effectively and you need the effect or you want the effect, you can just put them on the team. There's a lot less of a cost to putting them on the team. So it doesn't really make as much sense to put that effect on a lot of characters. It becomes a bit of a given. You know, it's not very costly to acquire that buff for the team. So it becomes more less of a choice. Again, that's the whole theme here. But it becomes quite easy to acquire. The game might then be balanced in such a way where you would be frustratingly feeling like you really needed that thing a lot of the time. There's a couple of fights in Genshin Impact already that sort of require using a shield, or the fight is very frustrating, not really designed well unless you use a shield, so you don't absolutely have to use one. But for a lot of players' power level of their account, it should just say you need a shield almost. There are a couple of fights like that. And with 4 slots and a lot of shield characters, maybe not so bad. But if you had 5, you might expect that the game in turn would be developed a little bit more to essentially require those things, which you'll note that's literally just backhandedly putting back on the restriction on opportunity cost, making it so, oh no, the player has too much space, we better demand more of them. And I think that's also a bad balance. I think that puts you in a place. I'm just talking about that thing the whole time. But anyway, I think it's interesting. That would be worse, I think. Having the player have more space, but they need to check more boxes with every team, just makes them tediously go through the motions and makes the game less friendly to creativity. You know, the game demands a bunch of acrobatics of your team every time, but then gives you the space to complete them, rather than rewarding those benefits like a shield on your team if you have them, but it doesn't require them because you don't have enough space to always include them with every combination of characters. I think that's largely better. They're basically the same. One of them is just nagging the player more for checking a bunch of boxes. Some demands on the player is good, but increasing the amount of space while retaining build opportunity cost would mean demanding more of the player, and that can get out of hand pretty quickly. Again, that's a way that some games might argue maybe you should increase the amount of space, but I don't think that's good. I'd like to pause as a brief interlude to note that in Genshin Impact, a signature of when you get a 5th slot for a trial character is they just drop into your team. It's not like you can pick, of course, and so that character generally doesn't have amazing synergy with the rest of your team. They're just kind of there doing their thing, which makes it, you know, a lot less unbalanced. A lot of those fights are intended to be fairly easy anyway, so yeah. But yeah, I do think that's worth noting. Yeah, okay, but like what different build decisions specifically? Again, I think I would be looking at teams and thinking, might as well have a shield on, you know, like 80% of the teams I've made. I would think, well, I guess I'll add a shield, or, you know, I'll add an elemental resonance or whatever. I would probably the perspective of going from 4 to 5 would make me a little careless with that slot initially. Another difference that is really a different topic we could get into some other time is how adding this when the player didn't have it before is different than if you started with 5 slots the whole time, both because of how the game would be designed inevitably, but also because the player would inevitably just have a certain perspective. They'd think of the game in terms of 4 character teams for a while, and the 5th character would be viewed as an extra by the community for probably a very long time, I would predict, possibly forever, and would never really be considered to be a core aspect. In Genshin Impact, because you can only have one character on the field at once, there's some interesting maybe consequences. Characters that have abilities that have a short cooldown are less valuable because you have more characters that could be using their abilities. So the opportunity cost for putting a character on the field has actually increased, weirdly. I don't think in a way that would feel good. Again, it sounds like, oh wait, we got opportunity cost back. But it just means that characters that have low cooldown abilities would be kind of bad, like maybe undeservedly. I think it would also be a lot less necessary to focus on energy recharge. Genshin Impact, your characters have 2 abilities. One of them you need to charge up by making particles by using other abilities. But everybody gets some energy when you absorb particles. And so if there were 5 characters generating particles, the energy demand for any given character would go down. So for a lot of characters, they already don't really need any help generating energy. And now energy would just be a meaningless mechanic for those characters. Like they would 100% of the time have their burst up, which is just weird. Like it'd just be odd. So I would build less energy recharge, but again, for a lot of characters, I was already building none. And so it would just be sort of awkward. Again, you can see how the game is kind of calibrated to 4 characters in a certain way. They have done some math to make sure that the amount of energy you generate is, the right amount, however you want to think of that. Co-op also totally breaks this, by the way. In co-op, you can generally get a lot more energy because the on-field character gets more energy when particles are generated. This means that if there are more characters on the field, you generate more energy for focused characters. If you want to funnel energy to one character, it's easier in co-op. Or it happens by default if you're in 4-player co-op. So yeah, those are some weirdnesses. I would, I guess, be really greedy. I'm being negative about it, like there'd be no positive benefits. Yeah, you would maybe get into teams where you wanted to do a lot of reactions. You would run multiple characters of that type of element more, I guess, or characters that don't apply a lot of their element would be better relatively because you have 4 other characters to apply lots of that element. Because of the way the game is designed, you would rarely want to run 5 different elements. There might be some situations, but a lot of the time I think probably not. But it would be interesting to see the way in which running 4 elements but doubling up on multiple elements to do like 3 elements reacting together, but then have 2 characters of 2 of the elements. That was confusing. 1 Dendro character, 2 Hydro characters, 2 Electro characters. Or again, like Dendro, Animo, Electro, Hydro, and then 2 of one of those elements to get the resonance while still doing kind of a triangle or a quad of reactions. Is interesting. Like that would be a consideration, sure. I don't want to make it sound like this would be like a disaster, I guess. It would just be worse than the game's current design, I think. I'm painting it out to be like there would be only big negatives, and it's like, all right, I don't think it would be atrocious. It would just be worse. I don't think there would be any great benefit. Again, the minor changes here and there that you could view as a benefit, like characters with short cooldown skills being a little less valuable in practice because the sort of field opportunity cost is higher. I think that you could just balance them differently to do that. You don't need to make a 5th, character slot. Personally, I also think that we already have a lot of characters that are very powerful because they apply their skill effect and it lasts a very long time with a very short cooldown, so you can refresh it whenever you want, whenever you have a spare second. But the effect duration is incredibly long. They already ask very little field time. Adding even more space would make those characters even better because you can almost costlessly include their effect that does a lot of damage. That would make those types of teams ludicrously powerful. You could have 4 characters that apply a 30-second effect that they can refresh whenever the hell they want, that does tons of damage and requires no other field time, while you have 1 character sitting there while a fireworks barrage of effects go off. That type of team is already pretty powerful. It would only get an unfair buff if you were to add another slot for a character like that. And I think most other uses of that 5th slot would feel inferior to that type of thing. Something a little extra, which really fits the theme of, in a lot of games, the problem with adding more space to a build would be that any piece of situational utility would become basically free. Either the player would just equip every good thing where they had to pick and choose before, or they already are equipping every good thing, and it would feel like a piece of what was situational utility becomes an auto-include, or it's just easy to put there. In Warframe, what you hear people say is that there should be a dedicated mod slot for blah, 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 blah. And it's funny what you're not understanding when you hear people say that to those players. I'm talking to those players, not you. You probably understand this. Is that if you had a dedicated slot for this one effect, like that should just be an innate effect that you get for free. You either should pick to get it or not pick to get it. You shouldn't pick to get it, but there's no choice you need to make. That's just a waste of your time. Like that, the effect should either be better, so it feels like a good choice. You should understand that it actually is good and it is a fair choice over other options, or it should just become an innate effect. There's really no world in which having there be a dedicated slot for that would make sense. Except Warframe actually is a great example of the maybe only exception. Unless there's a ton of effects in your game which are of a lower power level, but within that power level there's a bunch of stuff of a similar power level. So in Warframe, there's a lot of weapon and Warframe effects mods that are kind of utility based. They don't directly increase your damage, or when they do increase your damage, they increase it in a way you could have increased with just positioning or something. So you might consider them ergonomic or utility effects, mobility effects. They're called Xalveris effects, and they have their own dedicated slot on weapons and on your Warframe. There's one slot for just that thing, which is good because those effects are almost inherently things that can't compete with, the other main mod slots. They're things that don't feel like even an infinite amount of this effect that isn't just completely broken isn't strong enough to feel like it competes with those other effects. So why not give it its own mod slot where it can still compete with all those other effects? But you'll note that there's a lot of Xalveris mods and there's only one Xalveris slot. So for any type of mod, like people say it for augments in Warframe, mods that change an ability's behavior, they say they want an augment mod slot, but you'll note there aren't a lot of augments. So for a lot of frames, it would feel like there was just one that would slot in, which is why that doesn't particularly make sense. Again, I also feel I once sat down a couple years ago and analyzed every single mod in Warframe, every single augment mod, to see how many of them I thought really didn't earn a slot over other mods. And personally, having talked to all of you and gotten your takes on these mods along with mine, very few of these mods do not actually warrant a spot in a build. It's maybe like 1 in every 10, which is still not good, but it's hardly most of them. That was how I felt anyway. Maybe at some point I'll do that video, but yeah, the kind of big kicker is that it's got to be that your game, the time to reduce opportunity cost is if your game has an entire class of upgrades that feel like they just can't compete for space, and yet they should be in the game somehow. You could maybe give those a separate slot. A lot of the time, games do this with guns by using different parts of the gun, a popular, flavorful way to do this. So for example, adding a sight to your gun, like a scope to see further, is not generally, in a lot of games, going to increase your damage very directly. It's often preference, or like it just looks cool. But that's okay because you're only choosing that in a single slot where you can only equip scopes in a lot of games. So it's not like you're sacrificing the ability to do more damage or something. They don't give you much of a benefit, but they're competing with other things that give you similarly no benefit. So you could just pick whichever one you want. Not every game uses that system this way, but you get the idea. Making slots like that have the same opportunity cost for a thing where you really feel it's valuable to have there be a bunch of these, but they can't really compete with other upgrades. Maybe that is the one exception where I feel like that does feel worthwhile. Another, maybe, in Warframe, a way to tackle the Warframe augment problem would be, I suppose you could just make a bunch more augments and then make there be only one augment slot and make it so something like you can't equip more than one Warframe augment, I don't think that'd be better or more fun than just making them feel good to more players. Again, I think in a lot of cases, the players are simply incorrect that the mod isn't like worth a normal upgrade slot. They're just in the mindset, or they're repeating this mantra that they're not that way. But Warframe's community, I think, is a unique problem with this. Usually the players are pretty in tune, I think, when an upgrade doesn't feel like it's competing for space. They're just not good at fixing that problem. I think Warframe has a community that is uniquely bad at evaluating those upgrades. That's savage, but I completely think that. I don't think many of them are actually that bad. Okay, Xalveris, at the end here, you actually have a spoiler that is your opinion. You said, for the majority of combat teams, a 5th slot probably wouldn't change much. 4 characters are already hard enough to efficiently swap between to squeeze damage and buffs out of off-field or skill and burst cooldowns between on-field attackers going hard. The potential of an extra elemental resonance by itself is probably worth more than whatever character you decided to place. I don't agree that it's worth more, but right, I think that would become a surprisingly large amount of the benefit would just be what element is the 5th character. Sure. The relatively short duration of most effects means that the time to swap to a 5th character isn't worth the loss of effect uptime. There are some exceptions, such as Raiden and Nilo with their 25-second and 30-second skills respectively, but they'd already be included in the first 4 slots of a relevant team, so a 5th slot still wouldn't provide much. Just gonna pause there. Again, I strongly disagree, but I don't have different logic. I just think you maybe aren't thinking of all the characters that have very long duration skills where it would be very easy to keep this skill active. You are definitely right that there are a lot of like burst effects, for example, where you would end up taking too much time. Like there's no time in your rotation to add that effect in. But there are definitely enough characters, in my opinion, that have long duration effects and bursts that don't take very long that you could easily fit in more for only a few different team compositions. Like I should have emphasized that before. There would not be very many of these super overpowered, incredibly long duration ability stacking teams. There wouldn't be very many teams like that, but they would be ludicrously more powerful than all the other teams, I think. So I guess I kind of don't disagree. I feel like you are underestimating the number of characters that have abilities like that and how good it would be if there was all of those effects going off. In particular, actually, a lot of those teams are a little restricted on what reactions they complete, and getting to build in maybe 2 characters that spend a good amount of field time and trigger lots of reactions, while you have 3 other characters that provide a constant barrage of, a certain few elements. It would just be free. It would be that in a lot of teams, I would agree with you. For a lot of different kinds of teams, the 5th slot wouldn't benefit you that much. And then the problem is that for this type of team, it would benefit you a ton. There would be almost no loss in effectiveness. And so that type of team would just be infinitely superior almost all of the time. And that would suck. So yeah, you say for the majority of combat teams, yeah, I suppose I agree. Yeah. Again, there are a lot of teams you wouldn't really have time to do that. Again, it would be an unfair nerf to characters that have very short cooldown abilities, because you could have just been using another character's ability anyway. Sure, yeah, I guess I agree. But it's a matter of degree, I guess. I think the exceptions would be the problem. Like those are the teams that would feel good to run. They would be very unbalanced compared to other teams. On the other hand, I didn't think of this part. Xalveris says exploration teams would love the 5th slot and would even push for more, just for the convenience of not having to open up the party menu, swap back to a pyro character for the 50th time to do yet another torch puzzle. Yes, so that's a great Genshin Impact specific example. Genshin Impact has a real problem with its open world exploration design. I think it's really the open world design, where the player is often asked to have an element on their team that how would you know to have that element? And so, you could run around with a team where you have Pyro, and if you're in Sumeru, which is very Dendro focused, you could have a Dendro character. The problem comes, you got 4 slots, you're saying. You need 4 or more elements on demand. First of all, you actually often do need 4 or more elements on demand, which is a problem. And the second problem is that Genshin Impact has Anemo resonance. When you run 2 Anemo characters, you get a movement speed increase, pretty big movement speed increase, and you get a stamina cost reduction so you can run for longer. With how much you run around the open world when you explore, you lose enough by not running Animo Resonance that you're asking the player to make a team that is purposefully slower just so if they happen to come across the need for this element, they have it. You know? Now, I'm not going to go on about this too much because it's very specific to Genshin Impact, and I don't think there's a ton to say. I guess you remove Animo Resonance. I guess you make Animo Resonance not increase the player's speed. I like that you can build a kind of speed-focused theme, but the other option basically is to make it so the player isn't asked to produce an element as quickly, or the player has a special open world ability to quick swap one of the 4 party members, like the 4th character slot. You could maybe hit a button and then make that be, any of 7 characters. So you could have a character of every element on hand ready to be quickly swapped in when you need them in the open world, kind of an assist thing. It could be a gadget. They have room in the menu. They could just put it in there. So yeah, of course, like that's the solution, like that's what they should do. But in practice, the simplest thing to do would be to remove Animo Resonance, I guess. And then, yeah, I guess most of the time, if you ran Pyro, Electro, Dendro, and some other element, within reason, you would probably have what you needed for most of the regions. I don't know. It's just frustrating. This is a game where you can kind of bounce from activity to activity, and yet the game often throws on the brakes, so you have to slowly open the menu, slowly switch to a Pyro character, and then slowly come back out. When the rest of the game doesn't provide that slowdown, it really draws attention to that frustrating little thing. Again, there's lots of ways you could solve it. I think it's pretty clear that the easiest way would be to just remove Animo Resonance, and the best way would be to let the player quickly swap in, one character of a set element on the fly without going way into a menu, without it taking too long. Maybe there's some reason they feel they can't do that. But anyway, again, the easiest and the best solution, I think it's fairly obvious. You could not demand those elements of the player, or more frequently provide them in the environment. Another kind of weird solution would be to make it so you almost always would be able to use Animo to spread the element you needed onto the place you needed it. So for example, anytime you need to light a pyro torch, there is pyro in range that you can swirl. So if you do decide that you want the speed, the player would then be able to still use the characters they had to do the puzzle. I feel like they probably wouldn't do that, and it would be a ton of work. They'd have to go to hundreds of puzzles throughout the game and put those environmental details in. That would be a huge amount of work for kind of debatably not a better solution than just letting the player quickly swap, elements or whatever. But yeah, that's my main thought about that. I definitely agree that exploration teams, it would arguably maybe improve the game a little bit, but I would rather they just did something else. And yeah, I guess we're kind of split our differences, Xalveris, on a 5th slot for a lot of teams. Wouldn't change that much, but those teams would be pretty inferior to the few teams where it would change a lot. And on those teams, it would be crazy. Again, when you say those would already be included in the first 4 slots of a team, a 5th slot wouldn't provide much, but it really would for the few teams where you could bring a 5th one of those effects that has a really long duration. And there are a lot of, skills that last a while and have like a 15 to 30 second duration and or cooldown. There are plenty of those effects. So I think you would have no difficulty making a team with 5 of those. It's not like you're kind of suggesting that you'd already have taken all of them by 4 slots, and so the 5th slot you wouldn't have another one to take, but there definitely are enough, in my opinion, that you could take a 5th one. And that would give those teams a basically consequenceless power boost, whereas other teams, I think you're right, would gain kind of nothing. And so that would make it very, very unbalanced. It would be not good for the game's balance in its current state. I think that's all I have to say. Yeah, probably don't reduce your opportunity cost, game developers. I wouldn't recommend doing that. essentially ever. Again, like I feel like if you're the exception and it's a game where you really got it wrong the first time, you would really know. Now, a final closing thought. I've One reason I do parlay like this and have done this for a living is that I've always been frustrated about feeling like games don't include some little detail that would just make the game basically better, but they just kind of don't know about that thing, I guess. No one can play all games, no one knows all builds, that whole thing. And by doing this, I accumulate game design ideas, and as I can write them down and accumulate them over years and years and be reminded of them by all of you, when I eventually make a game, I want to include the motherlode of this stuff, you know? And one thing that this makes me think is it would be interesting to design a game in such a way where the game had an interesting metagame or balance with very limited opportunity cost, very strict opportunity cost, very limited build space. But then you could open it up a lot and the game wouldn't break somehow. There would be some way in which the game's balance would kind of survive that effect. I really don't know how you would do this. I feel like the only thing that comes to mind would be maybe when you have less space in your build, upgrades are stronger. So for example, you can get an increase to your health. And when you have only 2 slots for upgrades, the health increase doubles your health. It's huge. If you have 4 upgrade slots, the health increase gives you 25 or 50% more health. Still a lot more health, but not as much as the other thing. That's a way too simple example. But you get the idea that if upgrades were much stronger, there'd be some effects that would be significant in a different way, whether you had a small or large number of build slots and at different amounts of build space. Certain types of effects or certain synergies would be more or less prominent. For example, if you have 4 build slots, you could balance the math fairly easily such that things that were your damage modifiers, you get 50% multi-shot and 50% base damage and 50% crit chance or whatever, the individual power level of all those goes down because you have 4 build slots. But because of the way that those effects multiply each other's benefits, you would get more total damage from a build that tried to mix multipliers than in the version of the game where you have only 2 upgrade slots. They would each individually provide more, but they wouldn't combine with as many other, you could calibrate the math such that it would be superior to run a damage multiplier focused build with 4 weaker effects than with 2 stronger effects. That would be kind of interesting. You could create a game that would work well for people that don't focus that much on making builds and people that do focus a lot on making builds. That would be pretty involved. Hopefully you can see how you're opening Pandora's box of balancing problems a little bit. Continuing to do this kind of thing where you try to make every aspect of a game adaptable would probably make a game that is unbalanceable by a normal human, or whose upgrades had to be so simple as to be boring for the game to be balanceable. But your parlay really made me think a lot about, I wonder if you could make a game that changed the number of slots and then demonstrated or let the player kind of choose how much of a limitation they wanted. That's cool. Like that could be fun. Anyway, good stuff.